Hello and welcome to Power, People and Planet. I'm Kumi Naidoo, and this is a series of candid conversations with activists and community leaders from around the world who seek to tackle some of the biggest problems humanity is facing. Today I'm speaking with somebody I respect and admire a lot, and I'm sure many of you do as well, George Monbiot. George is a trained zoologist. I must confess that was a piece of his bio I didn't know until preparing for the podcast, and scientist, but he's most commonly noted for his courageous journalism and his political and environmental activism, for which he has been engaged in over 30 years. During his time as an activist and journalist, George has consistently been telling people really what they don't want to hear. And in this, I like to think that George and I have something in common, where often we have to tell people difficult, hard truths that people don't want to listen to. In 2022, he released an amazing book, has created quite a lot of waves, called Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet, where he explores the future of food production, which is one of the most climate devastating industries humanity currently engages in. And Regenesis grapples with some hard truths about this reality and presents us with some somewhat bold, some would say very controversial solutions to feeding the world's growing population, such as precision fermentation. So all I say to you, it's going to be an interesting conversation. Keep an open mind. If there's one thing we all need to do right now, is keep a bloody open mind. So let's do that. So George, thank you for joining me, and welcome to Power, People and Planet. Can you speak generally first? Can you speak a little bit first of this moment that we're in, where I'm sure, you are in a similar situation like I'm in, where often we are criticized for, making things too complex, being scaremongers, being drama queens is one that I've been asked, I've been attacked for. So can you speak a little bit about the complexity of the crisis we face and why this moment is so frightening on the one hand, but pivotal and calling for a level of moral courage that activism, politics, and leadership generally has never been able to show up to now?
Sure. Thank you very much, Kumi. Well, all those who have challenged power have been called similar names and worse in the past, as anti-apartheid activists are painfully aware in South Africa.
Sure.
The suffragettes knew it. The civil rights activists knew it. Independence campaigners knew it. If you try to create a new order of things, if you try to disrupt business as usual, if you try to challenge existing power structures, you will have everything thrown at you. Every possible argument, every possible insult, and every possible tactic to try to enclose you and shut you down, to prevent you from being effective. But of course, we need to be just as effective on the campaign to protect the living world as our forebears, our brilliant, brave activists in the past have been in securing our fundamental freedoms. And in doing so, we confront a series of enormous legacy industries: fossil fuel industry, chemicals industry, mining industry, industrial fishing, a huge range of powerful industries, but perhaps in terms of culture, at any rate, the most powerful of all is the existing food industry.
Absolutely.
Because food is a visceral issue. You instantly tap into very emotional issues indeed when you try to challenge what we're eating, the dietary choices we make, or indeed the dietary choices which are effectively forced on us by circumstance, by corporations, by governments.
In fact, George, it's almost cultural, right? It's almost food is seen as deeply and intrinsically cultural power.
Yeah. And the cultural power of the food industry, I think, is even greater than its economic power, and is something we often underestimate. You can't apply the same analysis as you might apply if you're fighting the oil industry, for example, because the oil industry is all economic power.
Yeah.
And they don't have much cultural power. But in the food industry, there's a lot of cultural power as well. And it's just as real a form of power, and it can be just as oppressive a form of power if it's not challenged and questioned. But somehow, as activists, we have to confront all these different forces which are bearing down on our life support systems with extraordinary speed. I mean, the speed at which it's happening is quite remarkable, much faster than most of the mass extinctions that have happened on Earth before. And the worst mass extinction of all took place about 251 million years ago, when largely as a result of volcanic eruptions in the area that's now Siberia, and the lava or magma burning through huge fossil fuel reserves underground, large layers of coal and other hydrocarbons which got burnt by those volcanic eruptions. There was several degrees of global heating, but it took place over many hundreds of years, probably thousands of years. But even so, that was enough to drive about 90% of species on Earth to extinction, and including nearly all large vertebrates. There was scarcely any vertebrate species bigger than a badger on Earth after that mass extinction. And we're now looking at something very similar in terms of impact, but taking place over a much shorter timescale. And those of us who are alive and adult today are in this extraordinary position that we are possibly one of the first and certainly one of the last generations to have the opportunity to change the direction that we're taking. We are now fully aware of what's going on, of what's happening, of what needs to be done. Unlike most of our ancestors who, wouldn't have been exposed to our level of scientific knowledge. And yet we have so little time in which to act. And that makes us very vulnerable people, but also very powerful people. We have this tremendous power to change the course of human history. If we leave things as they are, then we are bound to encounter a disaster greater than any humanity has ever faced before, the collapse of our life support systems. But if we come together and act with the power and strength that our ancestors have shown us, our political ancestors who secured our freedoms, then we can change that course, not only preventing disaster, but also creating a better world, a more equal world, a fairer world, a freer world, a world in which everyone's needs are met rather than just a few of the rich while everybody else must go under the water. And it's within our power to do that, because we have not just the scientific knowledge, but equipped with what so many of our wonderful forebears have done, we have the political knowledge as well.
But George, I say the same thing that you say. I say it in a slightly different way to bring a bigger sense of urgency, especially for leaders in my space here in Africa, where I say the window of opportunity for humanity to avert the worst of catastrophic climate change is very, very small and closing very, very fast. I mean, if we just look at where we are now, we're pushing on 1.2 degrees Celsius already. All the projections are we will get to 1.5 much faster than even the IPCC thought 20 years ago. And the people in the Pacific and in least developing countries have been chanting since 2015, 1.5 to stay alive. And that slogan actually changed already by Paris, where people in 2015 in Paris were chanting 1.5, we might survive, right? And that's the reality. Even if we make 1.5, which is looking increasingly more unlikely, there's no guarantee. I mean, my city, Durban, in April, people said we were hit by what they called a rain bomb, and close to 500 people lost their lives just like that, and infrastructure damage. So let's be clear that the impacts of climate change are happening on a massive scale, especially in places where people have contributed least to the problem. Having said all of that, George, the challenge for us right now is, right, how do we, on the one hand, speak truth to power of saying, folks, we are right there on the cliff, and time is not on our side on the one hand, but how do we also do it in a way that doesn't demotivate, depress, immobilize, and so on? Because you're absolutely right that if we're going to turn this thing around, we need a level of mobilization that humanity has never seen before, on a scale never seen before, with creativity we've never seen before. But how do we manage that tension between speaking the truth, but also keeping the sort of vibe positive and energized and so on, which we need right now? As they say, Martin Luther King's speech was not, I have a nightmare, it was, I have a dream. So we have to think about how we build realistic hope.
Sure. Well, before answering that, can I just add one thing? That
Please.
This is not just about climate. This is also about all the other Earth systems on which we depend. It's about soil. It's about fresh water. It's about the diversity of life. It's about the oceans, which are in the direst trouble now. It's about all these different interlocking systems. And sometimes, it's great that we focus on climate, but sometimes we do it to the exclusion of remembering what's happening to the rest of these systems. And as you know better than anyone, all this it intersects with social justice, with gender justice, with so many other unaddressed issues, with the oppression of power preventing us from realizing our aspirations for a fairer and greener world. So that's the preamble. But the next thing I want to say is that there's no magic formula. There's no form of words you can use which is instantly going to switch people on and ensure that they change their behavior and change the way that power operates. I've been doing this now for 38 years. I expect you've been doing it for at least as long. Yeah. and as you can try every single way of putting the case, every single way of trying to reach people, of trying to explain to people what the issue is. And if there was a formula, we would have discovered it by now. But basically, we are up against power, primarily the power of money in politics, which is the most dangerous force on earth. It's a corrupting power which prevents democracy from happening, which prevents our aspirations from being realized, which prevents our beautiful planet from being protected. And it can happen that almost everyone in a society wants a certain thing, and that thing is thwarted by a few people with an immense amount of money, which they can spend into politics to ensure that they get what they want instead, which is very often the opposite of what the great majority wants, because what billionaires want tends to be more or less the opposite of what the rest of the population wants. And there's this thing which I call the pollution paradox, which goes as follows, that the dirtiest and most antisocial companies are the ones with the biggest incentive to spend money on politics, because if they don't buy off politicians, they will be regulated out of existence. Right? If democracy is allowed to run its course, those companies will be shut down. So they have a major incentive to spend money on politics. And so politics then comes to be dominated by the dirtiest and most antisocial companies. So politics becomes extremely unrepresentative. It's the worst possible elements who are in charge, doing exactly the opposite to what the great majority of people want. So however well you make the argument, and however creative and innovative you are in trying to reach people and trying to change things, and let's face it, we've got some amazing activists on our side who are absolutely brilliant at explaining the issues and trying to change the way that we see them, we are constantly outspent by the power of dirty money in politics. That is the obstacle. It's not a rhetorical obstacle.
No, it's a total David and Goliath situation. Like say if I was...
However,
yes, go on.
However, to get to your question, and it's a crucial one, it's absolutely essential what you say. The thing which I find most inspiring and which motivates me to continue is that, like everything else that's important on Earth, society is a complex system. It's a weird thing, just like ecosystems, just like the human brain, just like the human body, whose properties are the emergent and adaptive results of billions of interactions. And complex systems actually all operate by the same fairly simple principles, paradoxical as it might sound, that they self-regulate under certain conditions. And then as they come under increasing levels of stress, those same self-regulatory loops become self-amplifying, and it can push the system towards a tipping point beyond which it can suddenly collapse. Now, in ecological terms, those properties can be disastrous. But in social terms, those properties can be turned to our advantage, because it's very clear that society has tipping points, that you can reach a point where things suddenly change and you go from one apparently stable equilibrium state to a completely different one. And if you get it right, that completely different one can be a far better state. Now, since I first became interested in this issue of social tipping points, there's been quite a lot of work done identifying where those tipping points might be. There's been both observational work and experimental work, and it all points to roughly the same amount, about 25% of the population. If you can reach 25% of the population with a new idea or a new perspective, then social tipping seems to become inevitable. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One reason is what I'm talking about, the complex system, that is the internal dynamics of that complex system that we call society, which drives it towards a tipping point when it comes under sufficient stress. But the other one is that we are, with the possible exception of the naked mole rat, the supreme social mammals. We're the most sociable of all mammals, except naked mole rats, who are a eusocial mammal, like bees and wasps and ants. Very peculiar. Anyway, we won't go into naked mole rats. But because we're hypersocial, we're constantly looking out for where the social currents might be going. Mm-hmm. And if we perceive that the current has changed, we'll tack round to catch the new drift and go in that direction instead. And so you don't have to persuade everyone. Once you've reached your 25%, then other people just fall into line with the new idea, because most people side with the status quo, whatever it might be, for good or for ill, very often for ill. A classic example is marriage equality campaigns in Western Europe. Mm-hmm. Because a few years ago in this country and other Western European countries, not long ago at all, marriage equality was going to be the end of civilization as we know it. Oh my gosh, if gay people are allowed to marry, the heavens will open, the earth
will collapse.
Yes, exactly. Society will fall apart. And gay rights campaigners very effectively, they didn't compromise at all. They didn't say, well, we want a little bit of equality. We want something which looks like marriage. No, they said, we want marriage equality. We're totally entitled to that. It's a fundamental freedom. We should be permitted. And they didn't try to persuade the reactionary old colonel sitting in his manor house who is sort of harumphing about these awful gay people who wanted to marry. They just widened and widened the social circle, starting with the people closest to them, and then expanding it and expanding it and expanding it. We're constantly being told in campaigning, don't preach to the choir. Well, who else is going to listen? You have to preach to the choir, but you need to make that choir a little bit bigger every time.
Yeah, you got to consolidate the choir but expand it. You got to consolidate the choir and expand it.
Exactly. Yeah. That's right. And trying to persuade someone in the opposite corner to you, that's a total waste of time. That's the old sort of old-fashioned debating model. I will persuade this person by the power of my rhetoric. It doesn't work like that, because it's not, when it comes to hard positions, it's not about preferences, it's about interests. You're not going to persuade someone through rhetoric. We massively massively overemphasize the role of persuasion in politics. You build your constituency, you build your base till you hit that tipping point, 25%, and then, without even thinking about it, the rest of society just falls into line. And I've literally come across people who have said, well, of course, I've always been in favor of gay marriage, who were exactly the opposite. They were firmly against gay marriage, but they believed that they were in favor of gay marriage because they simply swung round with the rest of society. And who cares? I don't care what they were before and what they thought before. They've come round without ever having been persuaded.
Okay, George, I want to come back to this question of how we deal with people on the other side, and how we deal with difference. But I wanted to just say to you that I have a slightly more scientific term that I use for social tipping points, which is crap threshold levels. Crap threshold levels, because I'm just looking at it in the context of a society where the social pressures are really massive now. I mean, inequality, I'm in South Africa, inequality is out of control. Corruption is on a scale that's through the roofs and so on. And what I am seeing is activism and resistance rising from a space of enough is enough and no more. Right? We cannot take this anymore. Right? Yeah. And so I'm just saying that whatever we call it from different places, you can see that, like there's a very nice Afrikaans sentence, which if I say it, you'll understand it, even though if you don't know Afrikaans, about just describing the state of the world now, where you say, ons is deep, deep, deep in the kak. And when
I think I get the drift of that. I don't think I need to be a brilliant linguist to understand broadly what that means.
But when you went through a couple of historical moments there, and why is it that people are so lacking in understanding, right? In the sense of why, and like if you look at the Iraq War as an example, right? When it first it was framed as Operation Iraqi Freedom, you might remember, right? And the story goes that it was actually called Operation Iraqi Liberation before it got changed to Operation Freedom, because it said Operation Iraqi Liberation spelled oil. And they said that's a bit too obvious, right? But if you think about it, the crimes that were committed, international law violations, the human rights violations, Abu Ghraib, and so on. And the uncomfortable thing that Europe and the United States must actually deal with the moment of fossil fuel expansion now because of the Ukraine, the invasion by Russia and Ukraine. The uncomfortable thing that must also be said is that the so-called democracy-promoting countries have never fully embraced democracy properly. They used it very, very self-serving and, episodically. They were invading, they were standing up for Kuwait and saying Kuwait was a democracy when there was no way Kuwait could be, And so in the moment that we're in, though, I want to come back to, I want to sort of push you a little bit on this thing, right? Because about preaching to the converted versus reaching out, right? Because I agree with what you're saying on the one end, right? That where do you start? You absolutely start with the people that are with you, right? But I want to suggest to you and see whether, I'd like to ask you whether you think I'm being unfair, right? After, almost 4 decades of activism now, one of the things that I feel is that absolutely, you got to consolidate the people that are with you first, and you got to expand in ever-growing circles fast, right? So we're on the same page on that as intention. But in practice, there was a very some time ago a sociologist called Robert Michels who talked about the iron law of oligarchy. He said, however democratic you start off any movement or structure and so on, there's an iron law that means that in the end it'll be controlled by a few people, right? So I put that as, let's also then say, how do we deal with the people that are not with us? Now, I've been saying something uncontroversial, so I'm going to say it, and I want to ask you to say whether how much you disagree with this. So while I agree with that part, I'm saying there has to be another part now. That activism cannot stop at the first or second circle that you expand from, because that's what happens often. If I look at my experience with Greenpeace, Amnesty, and a range of other movements that I've been part of, that actually you are very comfortable about actually consolidating the base that's largely with you already, and you make that base more and more committed and passionate and courageous. Ironically, that is not dissimilar from the approach that Trumpism and uses, which is you get the most committed supporters rather than a more broader base, right? So I have been saying, and some people have been irritated, admittedly, by what I've been saying, which is that activism today must self-consciously take on the responsibility of saying, we are so confident in what we believe. We do believe that we can win over some of the people that voted for Brexit, some of the people that voted for Bolsonaro, and some of the people. Because the problem for us is the math doesn't add up. There are too many people now. In all, Bolsonaro, we're talking 35, 40%. Trump, 35, 37%. Modi in the same ballpark, right? And electorally, we're in a mess everywhere, right? The systems are collapsing. It's, all of that. So in that context, how do we deal with this problem of winning over people that are not with us? Who's going to do that if we don't do it? That's the question, yeah.
Sure. So what I'd say, Kumi, is that we shouldn't regard any of these groups as a block.
Yes,
of those Bolsonaristas.
Absolutely.
There are some hardcore fascists who genuinely want to see a return to a military dictatorship in Brazil. They will do anything to get there. A lot of them have very powerful industrial interests, commercial interests in doing that. They want to deforest the Amazon. They want to ranch their cattle there. They want to dig gold mines, whatever it might be. There's no way we should even try to engage with them. As far as we're concerned, those are the people we just freeze out. They're never going to be part of our project. They are just going to disrupt it, fight it. They will kill to try to get what they want.
They have killed, of course.
Coup attempts. Well, yes, of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's just we should have no truck with them at all. And if we were to compromise our approach in order to try to make it acceptable to people like that, we lose everything. Before we've even begun, we've lost. Now, they're the hardcore, but then there's, if we take the case of Brazil, if we stick with that for a while, then there are his Pentecostalist base who aren't necessarily committed to Bolsonaro. A lot of his base was built through Pentecostalist and other evangelical movements there, which incidentally came about because of Pope John Paul II's crushing of liberation theology, which destroyed Catholicism in large swathes in Brazil, and then opened up the space for US-backed Pentecostalists to move in instead. And many years later, we've seen those results, and it led to helped lead to the rise of Bolsonaro. But just because someone's a Pentecostalist doesn't mean we can't talk to them.
Absolutely.
In fact, there might be all sorts of very interesting ways of talking to people in Pentecostalist churches that we haven't fully explored. And it doesn't mean that they are necessarily going to be hostile to what we want to tell them, and hostile to the protection of the Lord's creation, if we are to put it that way. But there've been, the churches to an extent have been captured by these far right movements. But we potentially, they could be brought back if we find the right way of talking. And then there's a third constituency of people who supported Bolsonaro, who were persuaded by outright lies on social media, WhatsApp groups sending out completely doctored images and utterly crazy claims about Lula, about the Payte, about whoever it might be, which people believed. But those people aren't committed. They just got persuaded by conspiracy theories. And among them are often some very poor people who have suffered immensely from Bolsonaro's years in power, particularly during COVID. And so, again, these are people who can easily be brought back, and I suspect that quite a few of them did, in fact, vote for Lula this time round. So I think I'd say, yes, you're right, but we should always be aware of who we're talking to, and never try to reach those people who are our fundamental enemies on their own terms. There's just no point, and this is where so many good movements have gone wrong, like the Labour movement in the UK, where it fell into line with Bill Clinton's approach, this triangulation, where we've got to speak to the working class, but we've also got to speak to the bosses, and we've got to speak to Rupert Murdoch, and we've got to speak to the other owners of the billionaire media, and because we need to have them on board. And in doing so, it destroyed much of what it was, and it became very hard after a while to tell the difference between Labour and the Conservatives.
Sure.
And so whatever we do, we have to avoid that trap of trying to meet the opposition halfway. These people are not our friends. They can never be our friends. There is no way we can ever work together. And trying to appeal to them and to appease them means that they will only drag us into their camp. I mean, there's this belief, which I'm sure you've seen a much more close up than I have, but I've seen it far too often in big environmental NGOs, which is, we have to appeal to those people in the opposite corner. So we have to trim our sails in order to go slightly in their direction, in the belief that those people will stay where they are, but they don't. We've seen the right all around the world becoming more and more extreme, demanding more and more preposterous things. There's never any point at which I say, "Oh, we got what we want, thanks. Great, yeah. That's good. We'll go home. We're satisfied." They don't do that. They just demand. You give them one thing, they'll want the next thing, and the next, and the next. So there's no way you can ever appease them. There's no way you can ever satisfy them. That you might be speaking a language that they too want to speak. It's never going to work that way.
I think this answer is brilliant. Let me say why, because it helps me with the dilemma that I'm struggling with. You've actually calibrated it in a very helpful way. Let me say what I mean by that, right? So yes, any activism, you start with the people around you. I mean, right now in the neighborhood where I live in Johannesburg called Yeovil, there's a complete decay. Right, complete garbage not picking up, roads not being done, all of that. It's awful, right? And so we are organizing a fight back. The first thing I did was exactly what you said: find all the people around you that you think will agree with you, and so on. So that meeting is happening just in 2 days' time, right? But we are very self-conscious now in a way that wasn't so much when we were young activists in the 80s against apartheid, where we are saying more consciously, let's design the architecture of inclusion, right? That we are consciously looking at people who do not agree with every little thing that we say will feel it's okay to enter. Because part of the arrogance of activism sometimes is we will only engage with people if they agree with everything that we agree with. Right? And that's never going to happen in the real world, right? So what you've done is you've then said, yeah, you don't disagree with me that we have to engage with people that we disagree with. But I think the distinction you made is how we deploy that energy of dealing with those that we disagree with is very important. And the example of Brazil that you gave is really helpful, right? Because I think that the agricultural fascists who are killing people in the Amazon, that are running slave camps in the Amazon and so on, the big interests in fossil fuels and so on, right? Clearly, this is where I think, and I stand mea culpa here, in retrospect, I made the mistake of wasting a lot of time in engagement with power in the corporate and political sectors, thinking that we were having influence through those engagements, when in fact all we were doing was confusing access for influence. We're getting access. They ticked off a box saying civil society consulted. We ticked off a box saying government or corporate sector lobbied on, and so on. So I think what you're saying is be very careful of where you're putting your energies with the people that we disagree with. And the example that you gave of the churches and the faith movement in Brazil is exactly the right example. Because those folks, even if you take Hungary, for example, and you take the support that Orban has, it would be wrong to say that everybody who votes for Orban is out and out fascists. The whole range of economic and other things that are being welded together. So I think it's really helpful. What you're saying is we don't have the luxury of not engaging with the people that we disagree. We agree with on that. But let's be very strategic. It's not about trying to change the positions of the people that are driving us to this point of destruction in the first place and have got us here. Yeah. It's not them. And in fact, part of our strategy is to isolate them as much as possible. But the difficulty is, right now, there are a lot of people who've... Okay, let's just play a little game, right? Let's say you and me, we're going to mobilize a global campaign to address deep economic injustice in an intersectional way with sustainability at its core, right? Mm-hmm. So we organize our 20 best friends from Africa, Europe, wherever. And we say, okay, what's the slogan for our campaign? So maybe we will end up with smash the capitalist system. That probably all our friends will somebody will say that, right? And you can get very active on, let's destroy the capitalist system. Now, the day before you launch the campaign, assuming that those that believe that the capitalist system in its entirety needs to be addressed were and everybody who had a disagreement were on a continuum away. The day you launch the campaign, you've actually pushed more people away from you because so many people have been misled into believing that they are major stakeholders in the capitalist system because they got a job in some company where they're being exploited, for example. So, but if you design the slogan as, instead, let's build an economy that includes everybody and doesn't destroy the environment, that might not be as sexy as the first slogan, destroy the system, but and it doesn't mean that everybody will jump into bed with you tomorrow, but it's saying that as activism, we are being conscious about building a bridge, a dialogue bridge with those that we disagree with, so that we can, because we are confident we are right, so that we can win them over. Sorry, I was so long-winded there, but does that resonate with you at all?
It does. The one thing I would challenge is you use the word not in there. You said that doesn't destroy the environment. So when you're devising a slogan, it has to be positive. Sure. Yeah. If as soon as you're negatively framing it, you're actually you've lost half your listeners. And so I'm constantly working on better ways, better language that we can use to describe what we want. And so, for instance, instead of talking about the environment, which means nothing, it doesn't create any pictures in the mind. What is this? Talk about tangible things, the living planet, the natural world, things which create pictures in the mind. And this, we should try to rethink the language right across, but also come up with positive slogans in everything we do. And when it comes to economic justice, what you're talking about in your example, the slogan which I've been using is private sufficiency, public luxury. And they're both good things, but they sort of, you can start to build a completely different picture of how society should function without telling anyone that they're an idiot. So the idea is that we don't have space, physical space, let alone ecological space, for everyone to pursue private luxury. And the only reason that some people are able to pursue private luxury is that other people aren't.
Yep.
And their private luxury comes about through exploiting other people and exploiting the planet. And if everyone in London had their own swimming pool and tennis court and art gallery and playground for their kids, London would cover half of England. England would cover half of Europe. Where would everyone else live? It's just impossible. And whether from the perspective of urban planning or the perspective of Earth systems, you just can't have everyone living like that. It's not possible. But there is space for everyone to enjoy public luxury. We could have magnificent public parks and public tennis courts and public swimming pools and public libraries and art galleries and public transport systems where you, instead of taking space away from other people in pursuing luxury, you create space for everybody through the public sphere. But that's not to say that's the only sector there should be. There should be a private sector. We should have our private sufficiency so that at home, we've got a secure home of our own, which has got the basic things that we need in that home. But if we want to spread our wings and live a richer life beyond the home, then we do that in the public sphere. If you try to do it in the private sphere, it's a zero-sum game. You can only expand your sphere of influence by shrinking other people's. And in your pursuit of private luxury, you're taking away necessities from other people. But if we pursue public luxury, then everybody can enjoy it.
Absolutely. And I mean, what you're saying is like so common sense. It's like, it's not rocket science. And it's a real challenge that we cannot communicate to people that this is this is common sense, and that's what we need to do. Now, in the remaining time, I really want you to talk about the book Regenesis, right? But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how do we change the food system, but keep the theme about how do we actually win people over, right? So here's what I would say to you, right? I love the idea that you present that we can revolutionize the food system such that we're using less land, right? The only output is water, thing that's released at the end of it. And it's almost as if making food out of nothing, a process of separating oxygen and carbon dioxide and some nutrients and so on, right? And I believe you had a pancake from that process that you said was just like any other pancake. So this sounds fantastic, right? But by the way, there are multiple really good transformative ideas of how we actually get out of the broader biodiversity crisis that we're in, right? So the problem is not revolutionary plans of how we should change how we do things now to how we need to do things in the future. The bigger challenge is how do we communicate this fast enough, broadly enough, so that it catches fire. So what I'd like you to start with is just basically talk about what is precision fermentation. You talk about fermentation rather than a revolution. So just describe it briefly, and then I'd like you to go to, well, how are we going to communicate this and win people over?
Yeah, got you. Sure. Okay, so first of all, I'd say we should, in thinking about the food system, we should actually divide it into three separate categories because they actually operate in quite different economic ways and different ecological ways as well. One is grain and root crops. One is horticulture, so fruit and vegetable, and the other is protein-rich foods, principally from animals. And we need to transform all three of those sectors because all of them have massive ecological and social justice implications, which are really frightening, really dire. It's very hard to see how we can continue to feed even the majority of the world's population at all on the current trajectory without radically changing all these things and without destroying Earth systems. And in Regenesis, I spend quite a lot of time talking about how we can change in some very interesting ways our grain production and our fruit and vegetable production. But the biggest challenge of all, because it's by far the biggest component of the problem, is changing the way we produce our protein-rich and fat-rich foods. And livestock is up there with fossil fuels as being the greatest threat to life on Earth. A massive component of our climate problem, but also the biggest use of land, the biggest cause of water pollution in many countries, the greatest cause by a long way of wildlife loss and of species extinction, driven by our demand for animal products. And that demand is growing globally very quickly. And already it's the case that of the world's mammals, only 4% of the weight of those mammals are wild animals. 36% are humans, and 60% are our livestock. And yet, at the current rates of growth, we're going to see another 400 million tons of livestock on Earth by 2050. It's completely unsustainable. That we're talking about a doubling here. It just can't be done without trashing everything. But people want to eat protein-rich and fat-rich foods. That's fine. That's okay, because we now have what I think is potentially the most important environmental technology ever developed, which is this thing called precision fermentation. And it's farming, but it's farming of a very different kind to anything we're used to. That instead of breeding and selecting multicellular organisms like plants and animals, you are breeding and selecting unicellular organisms like yeasts and bacteria, for example. It's a one-cell revolution. And we've scarcely explored the potential of single-celled creatures, and yet it's absolutely massive, both to greatly reduce our environmental footprint and to ensure that everyone is well fed much more cheaply and easily than from the production of animals. And some forms of precision fermentation don't require any land-based inputs at all. The feedstock to feed, for instance, some of these bacteria who produce very tasty products indeed, can be hydrogen or can be methanol, which you can make from renewable electricity. And all you need on top of that is some water, some carbon dioxide, and a very small amount of fertilizer. And on tiny areas of land, a few relatively small factories, you can produce the world's protein. And you can do it anywhere. Preferably anywhere with a lot of sunlight, because that's your feedstock. Effectively, you produce using sunlight to make renewable electricity, which with which you electrolyze water to produce hydrogen. So straight away, you're doing two things. You're shrinking the footprint
of the entire
food production to a tiny dot, to thousands of the land area currently used. And you can take enormous pressure off land and then start to rewild that, to bring back natural ecosystems, to hand land back to indigenous people, to reverse much of the damage that we've been doing. You have a contained system, so doesn't pollute the planet in the way that livestock has been doing, with all the shit pouring into the rivers, all the fertilizer pouring off the land, so many other devastating impacts it's been having. But on top of that, you can do it anywhere. So we've seen this very frightening situation, which has been highlighted in particular recently by the war in Ukraine, but long predates that, where an increasing number of countries have become utterly dependent now on food imports from thousands of miles away, and particularly when it comes to high protein food. And we've seen just how vulnerable those chains have become, and just how concentrated also. I mean, so roughly 90% of the global grain trade is in the hands of just 4 corporations. And they exercise tremendous power over extremely vulnerable people. What I would love to see happening is precision fermentation, which is really just a kind of brewing. It's just a refined form of brewing, being used to set up microbreweries all over the world. Every town could have its own brewery where you produce protein-rich, fat-rich products tailored to local markets.
So where is the technology already, George? Where is it at the moment? You say that it's being tried in Finland already, right?
Yes, I mean there's several companies and university departments have developed it, and it's ready to go. It's just waiting for regulatory approval. So the European Union, that's quite a long process. But as you say, I ate a pancake made from this flour, which came out at the end of this process, and astonishingly, it tasted just like a pancake.
You couldn't tell. You if you didn't know, you wouldn't have been able to tell the difference.
I really would not have known. It was effectively identical. But this isn't just about making pancakes. We can make very realistic substitutes for pretty well all the animal products that we currently eat, and there's been a great deal of innovation in this sector already. But with a tiny fraction of the environmental impact, and eventually much cheaper. So the other part of your question, how will we persuade people? Well, price is going to be a big part of that, because even though animal farming is massively subsidized and we don't pay anything like the real environmental cost for the animal products that we eat, it has hit its price barrier. It can't go much lower. I mean, this is why animals are treated so appallingly today, like the industrial chickens, which are brought to slaughter after just 5 weeks, having been pumped with food, get so fat that they fall over onto their chests, they can hardly move. The really terrible ways in which farmed animals are being fed is because they've hit the price barrier. They can't extract any more efficiencies out of them. And yet these microbes are at the top of the price curve, and it can only go down, and it's going to follow a digital style price curve because you can produce these products in entirely modular ways. It's much, much cheaper than trying to extract more efficiencies from multicellular organisms. And so we could see effectively identical products, which can also be healthier because you can not have a lot of the bad stuff that's in many of our animal products being sold at much lower prices. And then you don't need much more persuasion than that. If it tastes the same, if it looks the same, if it's got the same texture, and it's half the price, well, you've won that battle.
And just maybe we stand a better chance to prevent pandemics as well because of less reliance.
Exactly, because the biggest driver of future pandemics will be livestock farming. These big factories where so many animals are crammed together, they're just breeding grounds for new infections. And we can cut all that out as well.
Okay, so assuming we get the regulatory stuff passed in the next year or so, then how do we deal with the minds of people, right? How do we?
Yeah.
So I do think, though, you're not starting from a blank slate, because a lot of sort of these meat veg projects, as some people call it, there are some alternatives already, right? But obviously the processing of that is much more complicated and so on. But at least,
I mean, we've actually been eating precision fermentation products for a long time. So most of the cheese you eat is made with something called chymosin, which is produced from a genetically engineered bacteria or yeast. It's been on the shelves for 30 years or so. All the insulin that we produce now comes through the same process, and no one objects. No one minds this at all. It's just part of our diet. But now we can be producing our major foodstuffs by the same means.
And tell me, who owns the sort of patents and technology and all on this, because that becomes like a kind of can of worms normally, right?
Yeah, this is a crucial issue because it's really, really important that this becomes a distributed technology and not a concentrated technology. And if it's a distributed one, then it's going to be open to everyone on Earth to produce local food, and it's the only way for many countries in which they could have everyone fed with local food production, particularly when it comes to protein-rich and fat-rich foods, because so many countries now don't have enough fertile land and enough fresh water to produce all their own food, and they're stuck with this massive import dependence. But what we don't want is some mega corporation owning all the technologies. Now, the good thing about this is that the basic technology is, you can't patent it because it was developed by NASA in the 1960s, originally for the space program as a way of feeding astronauts. You can grow food in space by these means. And so it's way out of, I mean, it wasn't patented, but it would have been way out of patent if it was patented. The danger is that they'll try to patent particular organisms, and there should never be any patents on life. There should be no patents on biology. You can have patents on particular processes, maybe, that could be fair, but they should be weak ones, and there should be compulsory licensing for poorer nations so that they can use it without having to pay massive fees, but never any patents on life. That's just completely wrong. So one of our roles as activists is to say, okay, we've got this tremendous, powerful technology which could massively change the world. It could make a far bigger difference than any other environmental technology, but it must belong to us, to the people of the world as a whole, rather than to a couple of greedy corporations. There's nothing new in this or different in this. I mentioned that 4 corporations control 90% of the global grain trade. It's a terrible thing, but the answer is not to ban the global grain trade, because if you did so, billions of people would immediately starve. It's to break up those corporations. Intellectual property laws should be weak, or intellectual property rights should be weak, and antitrust laws should be strong. And that should apply to every single commercial sector. But unfortunately, it's been going the opposite direction. But these are political choices. We have to act democratically to change them.
Absolutely. George, before we round up, I want to ask you one question that's very topical right now. And I know you've participated in, multiple civil disobedience protests, including Extinction Rebellion protests and so on. And right now, it would appear that XR is favoring less disruptive methods and more engagement and so on. I myself, by the way, have been a friendly critic to civil disobedience that seems to make life for working class people worse than it is already, where they're just struggling to survive. And then you shut down their transport system, and yes, it might give you coverage. It seems like that criticism has been listened. Can you just, in the few minutes left, in 2 minutes, just give a quick response of how you think that's playing itself out and what's driving it?
Sure. Well, where Extinction Rebellion and similar movements are concerned, I'm a foot soldier in those movements. I've been arrested on an Extinction Rebellion protest. I'm very happy to take part in them, but I'm not a decision maker there. The decisions are made by consensus, but I haven't played any role in making those decisions. But what I can say is that they have been extremely effective in the past. There was a great wave of action. In fact, all the way up to the beginning of the pandemic, it really seemed that we were getting places. And then the pandemic stopped all that because we all had to go home. We couldn't gather in the streets anymore. And it's a real shame because the momentum was really building in countries like the UK. So we've had to start again, and it's difficult. It's difficult to do it twice. You don't get the same excitement. You can't get the same momentum as you had before. And we have to change tactics. There's no question about that. The tactics must be different simply because repeating tactics is a losing game. You just go backwards if you try to do that. So I'm all in favor of them exploring different ways of doing it. And not everything that Extinction Rebellion did was right. They got some things badly wrong, but actually most of the time when that happened, it wasn't the main body of Extinction Rebellion doing it. It was one or two breakaway people who weren't listening to anyone else. And a classic example is when they stopped the underground trains in London. It was very strongly opposed by the great majority of people in Extinction Rebellion, but 3 or 4 activists ignored them all, went ahead and caused, I think, enormous damage to the movement for exactly the reasons you're saying. That's stopping public transport, which is part of the solution.
Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah,
and in doing so, preventing people from going about their business by entirely legitimate means of going about it. And paradoxically, I was released from the police station, having been arrested the day before, and had to take the underground train to get to the Eurostar terminal to travel to Brussels, where I was doing a talk, and very nearly missed my train because of the Extinction Rebellion activists. So I was quite pissed off with it myself.
So I would like to just thank you so much, George, not just for this interview, but for your willingness to really be what Martin Luther King called creatively maladjusted, right? Which is not to accept a broken status quo and to push back on it with, deep intellect, compassionate humanity, and also just having the tenacity to keep going for as long as you've been going. So thank you. I think it won't be a surprise for you to hear this from me, but you inspire many people in the global north and in the global south. And we just encourage you to continue doing what you're doing. And we hope that if we speak in a year's time, that the world would be in a significantly better place because people have had the courage to recognize that the way activism is happening now has many good elements to it, but bottom line is it's insufficient to address the scale of the challenges that we have. And just as we say to business, it cannot be business as usual, we need to also say it cannot be activism as usual. George Monbiot, thank you.
So right.
George Monbiot, thank you so much for all that you do, and good luck with promoting this revolution in thinking about food, and particularly the protein component of it. And I'm certainly going to be somebody who's going to be supporting you along the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kumi. It's been a total pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners and viewers for joining us for this discussion. Please make sure you do all those things, follow, subscribe, and show your support. It makes a difference. And we look forward to continuing the conversation, courageous conversations on humanity's future. And remember that you have the capability to make a difference, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Thank you very much.